Welcome back to the program. Today, I'm very pleased that we're joined by Dr. Gad Saad, a scholar at the Declaration of Independence Center for the Study of American Freedom at the University of Mississippi, to discuss his upcoming book, Suicidal Empathy, and one of his previous books, The Parasitic Mind, How Infectious Ideas Are Killing Common Sense. So thank you so much for coming on the program.
Lovely to be with you. Thank you.
So, when I saw the title of your upcoming book, Suicidal Empathy, I thought of a remark by Elon Musk that empathy could be a huge or a big weakness for the West. And, well, in my opinion, his comments was widely, I guess, or misinterpreted, if not deliberately so, in terms of being criticized. And I also noticed from Twitter or X that Elon Musk is obviously a fan of yours. So I thought it would be a good place to start about the thesis of your upcoming book. That is why empathy can be both noble as well as a dangerous thing.
Right. Perfect. Thank you for that question. So empathy, when properly modulated, is a perfectly adaptive virtue to possess. We are a social species. Social species that need to interact with each other must have both cognitive and emotional empathy. For you and I to have a meaningful conversation, I have to put myself in your mind. This is called theory of mind. And that allows me to then infer certain things, how I should speak to you, what can I assume about what you know or don't know. By the way, autistic children, the way that you diagnose them as being autistic, there is no blood test, right? There is no genetic marker. What you do is you give them a theory of mind test, which they typically end up failing. And that's how you find out that they're autistic. So empathy is perfectly fine when it targets the right people in the right situation in the right amount, which of course, although he didn't apply it to empathy, Aristotle had already explained this to us in his Nicomachean Ethics, where he talked about the golden mean, right? Life is about identifying that sweet spot. The problem with suicidal empathy, according to my thesis, is that it is a dysregulated, maladaptive form of an otherwise adaptive process. And let me here just explain what I mean by that. So, for example, if you take OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, right, you're constantly scanning for threats and then attending to those threats. So if I suffer from germ contamination fear, I will wash my hands for 8 hours until my skin is falling off. I won't make it to my job. I'll get fired. But scanning the environment for environmental threats, when properly modulated, makes perfect evolutionary sense. If you and I meet in Oslo, and I notice that you just sneezed in your hand, and then you're about to shake my hand, I might very quietly and discreetly, after we shake hands, go to the bathroom and wash my hands. But I wash them once and I move on with my day. So in the same way that OCD is a maladaptive mechanism of an adaptive process, same thing with suicidal empathy.
And you make the point though that in evolutionary biology, empathy is required for engagement and cooperation. But how do you see ideology changing the function of empathy?
Well, it's coming from the left, if what you mean by ideology in this case are political orientations. The left in general considers itself the party of compassion and empathy, right? Barack Obama was the empathy in chief president, right? He's the one who said we have a gap in empathy. We need to be more empathetic and so on. And again, that's perfectly fine as long as you're targeting it to the right people in the right amounts, right? It makes perfect evolutionary sense for you and I, if given the choice, to risk our lives to defend our biological children more than we would random children. This doesn't make us evil. It doesn't make us diabolical. It doesn't make us callous. It makes us evolutionary beings that have evolved the cognitive, emotional, and behavioral systems that would confer upon us some evolutionary advantage. And so, what the left has done, to your question about ideology, is that they have taken ownership of empathy, but in the service of being empathetic, they've become orgiastically and suicidally empathetic, which is not a good thing.
So sacrificing their own in-group for an out-group in those
Exactly.
terms. Yeah.
So here is how I can demonstrate that I am ultra progressive. By the way, you're currently in Norway, yes?
Yes, that's correct.
Yes, you guys, I'm happy to tell you that this professor right here is hereby diagnosing all of Scandinavia, but certainly Norway and Sweden, as suffering from stage 5 suicidal empathy. Stage 4 is the highest you could have reached. You've exceeded the possible metrics, and we can get into that. Look, here is what the left or the progressives do. I am so progressive. I am so kind. I am so empathetic. I'm so compassionate that what better way to demonstrate that than to engage in the highest form of costly signaling? And by the way, costly signaling has a very specific term in evolutionary biology, which I can get into if you want. But I'm going to sacrifice our women, our culture, our heritage, our religion, our traditions, our children. I'm willing to sacrifice all to demonstrate the purity of my empathetic system. And that's what you end up having.
Yeah, that is interesting how some of the culture has shifted. So in the past, protecting children would be your own children, especially would be at the center. But now it seems that some of the, well, let's call it, the ideologies coming from the West, it does almost encourage one to look the other way, even if one's own kids might come to harm. I'm thinking then perhaps more in the gender ideology, where you're supposed to, bow at the altar of these ideologies, even at the peril of your own children. So it is unique. It seems to go up against the evolutionary biology.
Exactly. So take, for example, what's happened in Britain for the past 30 years, up and down Britain, in every big city and small cities, there have been, I mean, there are different estimates that vary from 250,000 up to 1 million young British white girls that have been systematically raped, gang raped, groomed by predominantly men of a certain heritage. They're Asian men because we want to use a euphemism to hide their real identity, right? I happen to be Asian. I'm from Lebanon. Japanese are Asian. Indian people from India are Asian, but that's not who the perpetrators are. They're largely Pakistani men of Muslim background who then justify why they do what they do because of their quote culture and religion. Well, the British government decided that in the hierarchy of important objectives to pursue, defending their children was substantially less important than protecting the noble reputation of these noble Pakistani men, and therefore shut up and don't report the gang rape of your daughter. As a matter of fact, there are cases where a dad went into one of those homes, he was arrested for breaking an entry and so on. So that's why I use such powerful language like suicidal empathy. Another term that I use in the book is I call it civilizational seppuku. Seppuku is a form of Japanese honor ritual where you commit suicide to resolve the fact that you have lost face, right? So you would see it, for example, in samurai culture that is very much rooted in a calculus of honor and shame. Well, if I do something that is very shameful, the only way that I can have a road to redemption is to honorably kill myself. Well, in this case, the way that the West has decided to redeem itself because it's such an evil empire built on slavery and Islamophobia and transphobia is to kill itself at the altar of suicidal empathy.
Sounds like you're describing German modern culture almost, but
German, Swedish, it's everywhere.
But do you see this as being uniquely Western, though?
It is uniquely Western in its current manifestations. In the book, I talk about other instances of cultural and historical instantiations of suicide, right? But they're not rooted in the same mechanisms that lead to the current form of suicidal empathy, right? So, for example, there have the Masada story of the Jews when they're on top of the Masada mountain. Well, when they realize that they're probably going to all be killed, they engage in sort of a collective suicide, right? There are cults who engage in collective suicides. When various Hindu tribes were being taken over by Islamic conquerors, they would engage in a type of collective suicide because it's better to die honorably than to have the men killed and all of the children and women taken as sex slaves, as we saw with ISIS, say with the Yazidi. So there are previous instantiations of culturally sanctioned collective suicide, but it's never come in the manner that it has in the West. That's a very unique phenomenon.
Well, yeah, start off saying your book on, again, I have to emphasize it's upcoming for those who want to try to find it on the internet. Suicidal Empathy is upcoming, not out yet, but it seems to build to some extent, though, on your former book, well, one of your former book, The Parasitic Mind. I was wondering if you can explain how the two fit together, because the parasitic mind, it's I like the analogy though there in terms of the ideas almost functioning as an infection that erodes common sense.
Yeah, exactly. So the way that they are connected together, and then I'll drill down into what I mean by the parasitic framework. The way that they're connected is as follows. If I truly want to hijack a human mind, I need to hijack two systems. I need to hijack and parasitize, zombify your cognitive system, your ability to think, but I also need to hijack and parasitize your ability to feel, your emotional system, right? We are both a thinking and feeling animal, right? They don't go against each other. It's not only reason that drives us. We have evolved an emotional system that solves very clear evolutionary problems. So if I want to complete the story of how to fully turn you into a zombie, void of any capacity to pursue your evolutionary interests, then I have to explain how both your cognitive and emotional system is destroyed. So that's why there's the 1-2 punch of the parasitic mind and suicidal empathy. Now let's drill down, if I may, on the parasitic mind. Let's back up a bit. So when I finished my PhD, my original goal, which I pursued in my scientific career, was to try to apply evolutionary biology and evolutionary psychology to study human behavior in general and consumer behavior and economic behavior in particular. What are the biological forces that cause us to be the consumers that we are in the real world, in the marketplace? Okay. Well, that to me seemed like a very obvious thing to do. Of course, human beings are biological beings. Of course, consumers are driven by their hormones and so on. Well, to most of my social scientist colleagues, that was complete lunacy. That was complete heresy. What kind of quackery is this? How did you end up in the business school? You should have been in some biology department. What we know in the business school and in the social sciences and in the humanities is that humans are not driven by their biology. What makes them human is that they transcend their biology. Biology matters for the mosquito. It matters for the zebra and the giraffe and your dog. Surely you don't think, Professor Saad, that it applies to human beings. So that was my first exposure to what I then ended up calling parasitic thinking. How could these supposedly intelligent people with many degrees before and after their names be such complete imbeciles, such deniers of reality? So that was the original place where I saw it. And then as my career progressed over the next 3 decades, I kept seeing further and more assiduous attacks on reason. So now I wanted to find a framework to try to explain all of these departures from reason. Now, as an evolutionist, one of the things that you do is you try to find what are called analogies and homologies with other species, right? So for example, I can show you that the sex specificity of toy preferences are the way that they are, and it's universal and it's biological based by showing you that vervet monkeys and rhesus monkeys and chimpanzees exhibit the same sex specific toy preferences. Okay, so I was already trained to think, where can I see this in animal behavior? And so then I started searching the literature, and then I came across the field of parasitology, which is simply the study of the interaction between parasites and hosts. So, for example, a tapeworm can parasitize your intestinal tract. But a neuroparasite, so the subfield of parasitology called neuroparasitology, is the specific parasites that hijack the host's brain, altering its behavior to suit its interests. So the classic example that many people have heard me now use, and it's become globally viral, when I call someone a wood cricket. The wood cricket detests water. It's an insect about this big that doesn't want to have anything to do with water. But when it is parasitized by a neuroparasite called a hairworm, well, then the hairworm needs the wood cricket to jump into the water, commit suicide, because then it could complete its reproductive cycle in water. And so there I had my epiphany. Aha, I will now argue that human beings could not only be parasitized by actual physical brainworms, they could be parasitized by ideological brainworms. And so I describe all of those brainworms in the book, and then hopefully I offer a mind vaccine with zero side effects.
Well, in the social sciences, or then especially sociology, it is the argument of the sociological man that he is very much driven by biology, that one of the key instincts in human nature, for example, that we organize in groups. This is where human beings find meaning, security. So, but still, if one starts to refer to human beings in terms of their instincts, yeah, departing away from the idea that they would be a completely rational being, which again is at the foundation of sociology, well, one still could meet some opposition if it seems to go against some of the current ideological dogmas of our time. But what I find interesting is it seems that one often come across people are very smart who believe in very strange things. Do you see this being more prevalent though in the universities in terms of I mean, we're supposed to be dedicated to scientific methods, but there's still yeah, a lot of things which seems to contradict this. Do you see anything special about academic institutions?
I will answer that last question in a second, but just to sort of add to what you said about sociology and the instincts, I would venture that most sociologists actually never invoke evolved instincts as the mechanisms that drive social phenomena. Now, there is a subfield that's very much evolutionary based, not necessarily in sociology, called human ethology. Ethology is the field of studying the evolutionary roots of instinctual behavior. So, for example, Konrad Lorenz, who co-won the Nobel Prize in 1973, demonstrated a mechanism called imprinting, right? Where if you take ducklings that are about to hatch, and the first moving thing that they see is Konrad Lorenz, then they will be imprinted on him because there's an evolutionary mechanism, an instinctual mechanism that simply says, whichever you see moving when you come out of the egg, that must be mama. So I could replace Konrad Lorenz by a German Shepherd. German Shepherd becomes mama. So in sociology, regrettably, there isn't much evolutionary based thinking. Okay, but that notwithstanding that, to your question, all of the parasitic ideas that I mentioned in the book, every single one of them originally was spawned on university campuses. Because as I explain, people think that I'm sort of joking. It's only because I say it in a funny way, but it uniquely takes professors to come up with some of the dumbest ideas that are perfectly decoupled from reality, right? Because many of those professors don't face the burden of the autocorrection of reality, right? So, for example, in the business school where I'm housed, or in engineering school, you're tethered to reality. If you build an economic model of consumer choice using queer mathematics or postmodernist mathematics, it's not going to predict anything. If you build a bridge using postmodernist physics, the bridge will collapse. So therefore, those fields, because they are inherently applied where there is an autocorrective mechanism called reality, will have lesser infection of stupidity and parasitic ideas. But sociology and the lesbian dance theory and queer studies and all the rest of it don't have to face the burden of reality. So the professor can stand up in front of totally gullible, malleable young people who just look at the professor saying, "Oh, professor, you're so smart." And then the professor says, "Hey, the science is settled now. Men too can menstruate." Well, imagine that in the 21st century, we have professors. By the way, not just professors. I've had heated exchanges with physicians who specialize in female reproduction. They're called obstetrics and gynecology, right? Who were chastising me for saying things like, no, no, only women menstruate. So if I can get a physician who specializes in female reproduction to say that no, both men and women menstruate, that's a problem. And so it starts off in the university ecosystem. But as I explained many years ago, when I first started screaming about all the lunacy and nobody would listen, people would say to me, okay, sure, there is stupidity on the university campus, but surely this is, who cares? It's just in some esoteric department in some humanities. I say, no, no, it starts off there, but the virus eventually escapes the lab. And that's what you end up having. You end up having politicians in Norway and Sweden and Canada and Denmark and Italy and Spain and Britain that are parasitized by those things. So it starts in the university ecosystem, but then it infects everything.
Yeah, what often surprises me how a topic which there used to be consensus for suddenly becomes, well, there's a new consensus without the actual debate taking place, it seems. So, for example, a decade ago, it was acceptable to say that one would be in favor of a traditional marriage. Politically in America, you had from the Clintons to Obama, they all said that they were in favor of this. But then within a few years, not only did everyone shift, but now you can't even argue in favor of it anymore unless you are a bigot. And again, a few years ago, no one had heard about the concept that men could also, bear children. And now, of course, if you challenge it, you could, well, disappear from the intellectuals there for being a bigot. So it tends to go across all spheres. So if one would question the problem of changing demographics too fast with mass immigration, one would be, of course, a racist. If one challenges the traditional, supports the traditional marriage model, one would be, hateful of the homosexuals, and of course, you would hate the trans if you, suggest that men can't give birth to children. But how did it become like this? Not just that they believe in it, but also that all dissent is now seen as hatred. Is this also built into the empathy aspect? So if you care enough, then you will, I guess, go after any dissent and police your own speech as well as others. So how does this work?
Yeah, so a couple of things. So there are two parts I want to answer. The first question would be, how could actually people internalize such absolute lunacy, right? And so I try to offer an explanation in the parasitic mind, and I argue that each of those parasitic ideas starts off with a noble objective. And to tie it to my forthcoming book, oftentimes the noble objective is maximize empathy to that privileged group at all costs. So if I have to murder and rape truth in the service of that empathy objective, so be it. Okay. So for example, radical equity feminists came along and said, hey, there should not be in society any institutional reasons why men and women are not treated equally. Well, that very narrow definition of feminism, most of us would put up our hands and say, yeah, okay, sign me up. I'm an equity feminist. I don't believe that there should be institutionalized misogyny. But then a more virulent form of feminism comes along and says, in the service of achieving equality, let's accelerate that objective by now arguing that there are no innate differences between men and women. As a matter of fact, all such differences must be socially constructed. So change the social construction, and then you have true equality. So what started off as a noble goal, which is for us to achieve equality across the sexes, gets metamorphosized into complete rape and murder of truth in the service of that goal, which then links back to another distinction I argue. Here I'm going to use two not competing, but two forms of ethical systems. There's what's called deontological ethics, and then there is consequentialist ethics. Deontological ethics are absolute statements. So, for example, if I say it is never okay to lie, that would be a deontological statement regarding honesty. If I were to say it's okay to lie if it is to spare someone's feelings, right? So if you're, I often joke, but I am being being serious, that if you ever hear the following question from your spouse, do I look fat in those jeans? Then put on your consequentialist hat and potentially lie, because you want to have a happy marriage and you want to protect the feelings of your spouse. And so you might say, oh no, you've never looked more beautiful. I might be slightly lying, but I'm doing it for a consequentialist and justifiable reason. Now, for many, many things in life, it makes perfect sense for all of us to be consequentialists. But here's the big but: for certain fundamental foundational principles that define the West, that define the scientific method, that define civilized society, those principles are on a bedrock of deontological principles. So it's not, I believe in freedom of speech, but not when it applies to Donald Trump because he's a really mean existential threat. I believe in presumption of innocence in the justice system, but not for Brett Kavanaugh, who might become a Supreme Justice. It doesn't apply to him. So once you apply a consequentialist ethos to a deontological principle, you end up with problems. And so put all that together, and it answers the question that you asked.
How durable is this, though? Because you would think that there would be too many internal contradictions after a while. That is, if the people who say we have to support women's rights, do you see the same people arguing that we have to have, men into female locker rooms? They say we have to protect the workers, their main salaries, but still we can't oppose mass migration, which would push the salaries of workers down. When does these contradictions fail to well, when does something crack? Because it does seem to be some logical inconsistencies, which one could shame for a while by portraying the opponent as being, bigoted or hateful or not having enough empathy. But surely at some point they must notice that they're turning on each other, I would assume.
Right. That's a great question. So the fact that there are such blatantly obvious logical inconsistencies is precisely why the neuroparasitic model is so apt, because it is rewiring, it is lobotomizing you, right? If you remember, lobotomy is a surgical procedure where you actually go in and you scramble the person's temporal lobe, right? So that's what's happening. So it's not clear to me that if you're fully parasitized, really beyond redemption, that any amount of logical inconsistencies are going to wake you up. But let's be optimistic. For many people, they will eventually wake up out of their logical inconsistent nightmare. But usually they do so not because they're intellectually honest, but because the winds have changed in a way that makes it no longer advantageous for me to be so pure in my insanity. Let me give you an example. You ready? Malcolm Gladwell. a gigantic moron, okay, who has spent an entire career. Okay, good for him. He writes books that are just rehashing of what guys like me do in the lab. That's great, good for you. But then he came out very forcefully against the idea that there is such a thing as evolved sex differences between men and women. This is crazy. Nobody thinks that. By the way, until 15 minutes ago, the 117 billion people, that's an actual estimate. The 117 billion people that had existed on Earth as Homo sapiens seemed to perfectly understand the very difficult problem of what constitutes male or female. But then we had to have Malcolm Gladwell come and tell us simpletons that no, this is not true. It's actually grotesque to not allow women that used to play in the National Football League yesterday and were called Bubba, but today they're called Linda, to not allow them into the bathroom with your 15-year-old daughter. That's crazy. The science is settled. That's because the winds were favorable for him. He needed to be invited to the really cool kids party, the really progressive parties in New York, and they had decided that you had to say that. But then this really mean orange Godzilla came along, right? Donald Trump, he changed things. The winds are changing. So Malcolm Gladwell came out recently, about 2 months ago. I don't know if you saw it. And he said, yeah, I guess I wasn't saying really the truth back then, but I felt very intimidated to say that. So imagine how cowardly you must be, how duplicitous you must be to say, I am willing to sacrifice thousands, if not millions, of actual women at the altar of trans activism, because to not do so would imply that some of my cool kids in Manhattan might not invite me to a party. So yes, there is an autocorrection, but usually it comes not because you woke up and decided to be honest, but because it's become too costly for you to be a moron.
Well, the way you describe it there, that is, you have these experts who suddenly emerge, and you have to trust the science. There's a bit of a contradiction there, though, because the whole point of the Enlightenment would be that we do not need to listen to the high priests anymore in terms of how the world is. Instead, we pursue scientific method. You have to explain your method, how knowledge has been created. Uh, but do you see any parallels there, though, between the religious dogmas and the, I guess, ideological dogmatism within the parasitic mind? Because I, I fail to see the when you make a grand statement like this, that there are no biological differences. I've heard politicians say this as well. Um, then this is a huge leap from what all cultures have pretty much had a consensus on, and we just skip it without having uh, any scientific approach to this. So how is this essentially a return to a religious dogma? How
It
do you
is.
not put it in that context?
No, I put it in I mean, the template is exactly the same, right? What's the definition of religion? Is that there are revealed truths, and those revealed truths could not be put through the epistemological test of the scientific method, right? So if you are a young Earth creationist who says that the Earth is 6,000 plus years old, and then I show you a bunch of dinosaur fossil skeletal remains or a bunch of rocks that are dated using carbon dating to 200 million years ago, you don't suddenly go, oops, I guess that screws my young Earth creationist. There is a way by which I can pivot so that nothing that you could ever show me in the record, in the scientific record, would ever disprove my position. And so, to your point, that's exactly what happens with the parasitic wokesters, right? I mean, if I can, to your point, if I could take the most fundamental definitional marker of our personhood, which is that we are a sexually reproducing species comprised of two phenotypes called male and female, if I can take that and argue that that is absolutely false, as Malcolm Gladwell explained to us morons in the back room, well, then it is a religion, right? I mean, as a matter of fact, I would argue that some of the positions espoused in religion, some of them are less ridiculous than some of the positions espoused by all of these parasitic ideas. And that's why, in my view, again, the neuroparasitic framework is so powerful, because there is no epistemology that could explain how someone could hold such views. It has to be that you've been ideologically lobotomized.
I wanted to ask how this spreads, because again, as you point out, this is not you haven't people haven't been convinced of these new dogmas based on presented evidence. But we also know that a lot of the way that human beings change their position is based more on the instinctive, that is, we adjust to the group. So if you look at how the abortion debate, for example, went in the past, everyone thought abortion was immoral. Now everyone thinks opposing abortion is immoral. And it's not as if we had a long discussion. It's more the group shifted and they communicate in the language of morals, and people follow the group. This is how human beings, a bit like animals, work in packs. But what is extraordinary here, though, is how quickly this all spread, and people kind of really dug into these things, because the more people seem to be challenged, the deeper they dig in. How can you explain the spread? Because this seems to go at the heart of even the language you use, the parasite, the spreading. how can you explain this? Because this is something that took me very much by surprise, how quickly it went, just
Right.
like wildfire.
Yeah. So let me first address the sort of the herd mindset that you invoked. So whenever I start, pretty much most of the courses that I've ever taught, where I'm going to talk about, evolutionary psychology and consumer psychology and psychology of decision making, I will often start with some of the most famous studies, some of the most famous experiments in the history of psychology. And I would argue that the most astounding finding, which is going to address your herd mentality point, is the series of Solomon Asch experiments. By the way, before I'm going to explain it nonetheless, just for your audience that might not know, but are you familiar with Solomon Asch?
No.
No, okay. So Solomon Asch in the 50s wanted to demonstrate the unbelievable ability for people to conform to things that they would have to be blind to conform to, right? So he devised a very clever methodology to test this. So he would bring in people into the lab, sit them together, and he'd come up with a cover story. Oh, I'm testing something about visual apparatus, whatever. It's nonsense. But the real point is this. Here, I'm going to show you one line of a certain length. Let's call it X. And then here, I'm going to show you 3 lines, A, B, C, one of which is the same length as X. You follow? So maybe line B is the same as X. Line A is very, very much smaller. Line C is much bigger. So short of you being legally blind or congenitally blind, there is no way you can get the wrong answer. Okay? So now I'm going to bring in 8 people to the lab. The first 7 that I'm going to ask are going to be Confederates. Confederates means they're pretending to be participants, but they're really in on the experiment. Only the 8th guy at the end is the real participant, but he doesn't know that the other 7 are not real participants. So now I'm going to ask the first person, number 1, please tell me which of lines A, B, C is the same length as X. And he's going to give the wrong answer, but an astoundingly wrong answer. It's A. And then number 2 says A. And number 3 says A. So now the weight of the hurt is growing on you. Yes? Now, when the eighth guy comes, instead of him saying, "Are you guys insane? Are you blind? What are you talking about?" Guess what? At a much higher number than you should have expected, resoundedly, defeatedly, he goes, "A." The weight of the pressure has gotten him. Now, look, I could explain this study to a 10-year-old, and he or she will fully understand it. That's the brilliance of Solomon Asch, or any real powerful experiment in the behavioral sciences. I don't need to have a convoluted experimental design to be able to demonstrate something that is so profoundly powerful about the human condition. So, now to answer your question. So, if I can get people to not believe their lying eyes, then it's only a short hop and a skip to get you to believe all of the other nonsense. Because the worst thing, to your point, is for me to be ostracized from the group. Also now known as the Malcolm Gladwell effect, as I call it, right? I do not want to stop receiving invitations in the Progressive Cool Literary Club of Manhattan. And if you tell me that men can menstruate, yes, boss, men can menstruate. That's the line. And so now to your second part of your question. So then how does it spread so quickly? Because there is no epistemological doorstop that says, "Hey, are you a moron? What are you talking about?" We are in a fully sanitized echo chamber where everybody is equally cowardly. By the way, those people are also called professors, because academia is astoundingly leftist. Depending on the field, it slightly varies. But if you're in sociology, you are much more likely to run into a horse with wings than you are likely to run into a conservative sociologist. Well, why should that be? Well, because we've created these beautifully sanitized echo chambers. And so take the fact that our minds have evolved to be fully parasitized by the herd instinct. Don't create any autocorrection within the beautiful echo chamber, and it will spread like the LA wildfires.
Yeah, this is Sigmund Freud. He refers to this as group psychology, though, and he made it clear that this would overwhelm the rational individual. So even if you, as would have all the rational competencies, if the group says something different, then it will overrun it. So there's indeed the concept of political propaganda has been organized around this theme, that how to get the instinctive to overrun the rational individual. Just as a very quick final question, though, because my first instincts then would be, if it's about this radical feminism or identity politics, any of this woke stuff or the gender politics, my first thought was, let's one can just be kind, go along with it, and why do all the hassle? But you see this in a wider context in terms of Western decline. How I was wondering if you can explain that.
Well, because look, what makes us human? I mean, there are many things that make us human, one of which is the fact that we've evolved the most complex machine known to the universe. It's called the human mind. And so the most dangerous force in nature, as I constantly remind people and post on social media, is a parasitized mind, right? There was a little guy with a little mustache about 80 some years ago who came up with the idea that I really know what is the cancer that's killing the great German nation. They're called Jews. And now, to your point about propaganda, I'm also a very good orator, and I know how to speak with a lot of passion and basically mesmerize people. And so I'm going to now convince them that, hey, let's get rid of the Jews. And people say, yeah, okay, sign me up. It sounds great. So all of the great calamities throughout history, and the most likely thing to bring the extinction of humankind, if I am to be hyperbolic, is not going to be Greta Thunberg's climate extinction. It's going to be disasters that were caused by faulty human minds, right? So yes, it sounds like, to our earlier point, who cares what they believe in the humanities? It's just some small thing. It's never going to go anywhere. Why do you keep screaming about this? Well, the people who are trained in the humanities and social sciences become our leaders. They have real power over my life and yours, right? In Canada, we are sitting on the most expansive amount of natural resources, whereby if we simply mine that, we would not need to levy a dollar of income tax from any citizen. But our greater overlords decided that to extract the devil's juice, it would be the rape of Mother Earth, because a demonic goblin called Greta Thunberg explained to the rest of us that we need to be kinder to Mother Earth. So bad ideas have real consequences. They result in wars with millions of deaths. They can result in endless poverty, right? Look at all of the endless war on poverty. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been spent, yet we haven't eradicated various forms of poverty or drugs. So it's not true that these dreadful ideas are just some cute esoteric stupidity that happens on university campuses. They impact real people in real ways. Our former Prime Minister, Justin Trudeau, is a walking manifestation of every single parasitic idea and reflex of suicidal empathy that I cover in my 2 books. Did that result in me having a better life in Canada? No. This is why I'm now at the University of Mississippi. So those who tell you, come on, you're exaggerating with all of this woke nonsense, nothing could be further from the truth. There is nothing more dangerous in nature than a bad mind.
Well, Dr. Saad, thank you so much for taking the time. It's truly fascinating work, and yeah, I really recommend that book, The Parasitic Mind. And again, so does Elon Musk, apparently. So thank you again.
Thank you, sir.